I never believed in ghosts. Not really. At least, not until that night in Hollow Creek, the night everything changed. The town had always felt like it held secrets beneath its quiet surface, a kind of eerie calm that made you think the shadows moved when you weren't looking. It was a small, forgotten place, the kind you drive through without stopping, where the gas stations are abandoned and the streetlights flicker ominously after sundown. But that house at the edge of town, the one everyone whispered about, the Victorian relic that seemed to breathe with its own malevolence, it was as different. It drew us in, like moths to a flame, our curiosity blinding us to the danger that lay ahead. We were just kids then, a group of restless teenagers desperate for a thrill, desperate to prove that we weren't afraid of some old legends. There were 5 of us. Myself, Sarah, Michael, Jess, and Tommy. We'd heard the stories our entire lives, how the house had been abandoned after a family tragedy, how people swore they could hear voices in the dead of night, how no one had ever been able to stay inside for longer than a few minutes without feeling a cold hand brush their skin or hearing faint whispers behind the walls. It was all nonsense, we thought, just tales spun to scare tourists or keep kids like us away. But that night, when the air was thick with the promise of rain and the moon barely visible behind the clouds, we dared each other to go inside. And so, we went. The house loomed before us, its once grand facade now sagging with age and neglect, paint peeling in long strips like the shedding skin of some monstrous thing. The windows, black and empty, stared down at us like dead eyes, and the massive oak trees that surrounded the property swayed as if whispering warnings we were too stupid to heed. We should have turned back the moment we crossed the threshold, but we were too full of bravado, too eager to laugh in the face of fear. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay and rot. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting weak beams that did little to dispel the oppressive gloom. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by our movements, and the floorboards creaked beneath our weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent house. I remember the cold, the kind of cold that clings to your bones, that makes your skin prickle with unease, like the very walls were exhaling frost. We stuck together at first, laughing nervously, teasing each other about ghosts and curses, but the laughter died quickly as we ventured deeper into the house. It became harder to breathe, harder to ignore the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. We explored room after room, each one more decrepit than the last, filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper, the remnants of a life that had long since faded into dust. But it was in the back of the house, near the old servants' quarters, where things began to go wrong. The temperature plummeted so quickly, I could see my breath in the air. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were so faint I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized there was no wind. The house was deathly still, and yet the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, slipping through the cracks in the walls, coiling around us like invisible tendrils. It was Sarah who felt it first, the cold grip of something unseen, something not of this world. I saw her freeze, her hand going to her shoulder as if to brush off the touch, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and for the first time that night, I felt it too. A gnawing sense of dread that clawed at my insides, telling me to run. We all felt it. The shift in the air, the weight of something dark and ancient pressing down on us, suffocating us. But we didn't leave. Not yet. It wasn't until we heard the scream that the fear truly set in, the kind of scream that turns your blood to ice, that makes your heart hammer in your chest. It echoed through the house, sharp and piercing, and then it was gone, swallowed by the silence. Michael. His name was on all our lips, but he was nowhere to be found. We called for him, our voices trembling, our flashlights flickering in the thick darkness. But there was no answer. Only the whispers, growing louder, more frenzied, like the house itself was alive with some terrible hunger. We searched, frantic, desperate, but the house had changed. It was like a labyrinth now, twisting and turning, doors leading to rooms that shouldn't exist, hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel something following us, something just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, watching. Every step we took felt like a step closer to madness. Sarah was crying by then, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she clung to me, whispering that we had to leave, that we had to get out before it took us all. But we couldn't leave Michael. We couldn't leave him behind. When we found his flashlight, lying in the middle of the floor in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the light still on but flickering weakly, I knew something terrible had happened. And then the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us in that room, the whispers swelling to a deafening roar, and we saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing in the corner, its eyes glowing like embers, its mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. It moved toward us, slow and deliberate, and I felt the icy grip of terror close around my heart. We ran. I don't remember how we got out, only that we did, bursting through the front door and into the night, the house looming behind us, silent and still, as if mocking us for thinking we could escape. But Michael, he was gone. We never found him, not a trace, not a clue, nothing. The house had swallowed him whole, and I knew deep down that it would never let him go. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a weekend camping trip to Whispering Pines National Park. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to get away from the city, away from the noise, and reconnect with nature. The kind of trip where you leave your phone behind and just exist in the moment. That was the plan, anyway. But if I'd known what would happen, I never would have set foot in those woods. There were 4 of us, Emily, Ben, Jake, and me. We were tight, closer than family in some ways. Emily was the leader, always organized, always prepared. She had a way of making you feel safe, even when things got a little sketchy. Ben was the joker, the guy who could crack a smile no matter the situation. Jake was the quiet one, always off in his own world, usually behind the lens of his camera. Me? I guess I was the glue that kept us all together. We arrived at Whispering Pines just before sunset. The trees loomed over us, tall and ancient, their branches twisting and curling like bony fingers. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that feels refreshing at first but sinks into your bones when the sun goes down. We set up camp quickly. 2 tents, a campfire, and the usual supplies. Emily made sure everything was in place while Ben made some offhand joke about being eaten by bears. We all laughed it off, but I remember looking at the dense forest and feeling uneasy. I shook it off. It was just nerves, I told myself. Nothing more. That night, we sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The flames flickered, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to stretch out into the darkness. Emily told some old ghost story about the park, how people used to go missing here, but no one believed it. We laughed it off, but something in her voice. I couldn't tell if she was trying to scare us or if she actually believed it. When the wind started picking up, the temperature dropped fast. It went from pleasantly cool to freezing in a matter of minutes. The fire sputtered, and we all started to feel the cold gnawing at us. One by one, we retreated to our tents. Emily insisted we stay close together, just in case. I didn't argue. Something about the way the trees swayed, their branches creaking in the wind. It made the forest feel alive, like it was watching us. That's when it started. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something. No, someone. Humming. It was low, almost like a vibration, a strange droning sound that cut through the silence. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was rhythmic, steady, like a song without words. I sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped my tent. The fire had burned down to nothing but embers, casting faint, flickering shadows. "Jake?" No answer. His tent was open, empty. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. A knot formed in my stomach, and I knew something was wrong. Jake wouldn't just wander off like that, not without saying something. I woke the others, and we started searching the camp, calling his name. We scoured the area, shouting into the trees, but all we got in return was silence, thick, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. And then we found his camera. It was lying on the ground near the edge of the clearing, half buried in pine needles, its lens cracked. I picked it up, hands shaking. The last photo on the memory card. It wasn't right. The image was distorted, twisted, like something out of a nightmare. It showed the trees, but they weren't just trees. They were bent, twisted into grotesque shapes, like arms reaching out from the earth. And in the distance, barely visible through the blur, was a figure, a human shape, standing between the trees, just watching. Panic set in. We called the authorities, but it took them hours to get out there. By the time they arrived, Jake was gone. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. They searched for days, brought in dogs, helicopters, the works. But there was no trace of him, just his broken camera and that twisted, nightmarish photo. After a week, the search was called off. They said it was probably a bear attack, or maybe he just got lost and couldn't find his way back. But I knew better. We all did. The way the forest felt that night. It wasn't right. There was something out there, something watching us, and it took him. I haven't been back to Whispering Pines since. None of us have. Emily tries to move on, pretending it was just a freak accident. Ben stopped cracking jokes altogether. But me, I can't shake the feeling that Jake's still out there, somewhere in those woods, lost in the shadows. Sometimes I can still hear that humming late at night, when everything else is quiet. It creeps into my dreams, pulling me back to that night, back to the trees and the shadows. And I know, if I ever go back, I won't come out again. Halloween night. It's supposed to be fun, right? A night of costumes, candy, and harmless mischief. But for me, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was the night when the thin veil between the living and the dead slipped, and I saw something that no child should ever see. I was only 10 years old, dressed as some superhero I can't even remember now. My sister, Sarah, was with me. She was younger, barely 6, with big, bright eyes that sparkled with excitement as she skipped down the street, her fairy wings bouncing with every step. The night was perfect, cool, crisp air, glowing jack-o'-lanterns on every porch, the streets alive with trick-or-treaters. My parents walked behind us, talking with other adults, the grown-up world miles away from the magical night we were lost in. I remember the moment it all changed. The laughter in the air turned cold, and the streets that had felt so full of life seemed to drain of warmth. Even the familiar houses started to look strange in the dark, the lights from the jack-o'-lanterns flickering like dying embers. I should have known something was wrong, But I didn't realize it until Sarah stopped. She was standing still, her small hand clutching her pumpkin bucket so tightly her knuckles were white. Her wide eyes weren't sparkling anymore. She was staring down the street into the cul-de-sac where the shadows seemed to crawl. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound brave, but my voice came out shaky. "There's someone there," she whispered. I followed her gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the usual shadows. But then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the cul-de-sac, barely visible in the dim light, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Tall and still, his face hidden by the brim of a wide black hat, his long coat trailing down to the ground. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I tried to brush it off. "It's probably just some dad waiting for his kids," I muttered, repeating what I'd heard my mom say earlier. But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Something about the way he stood, how he seemed to blend into the shadows like he was part of them. It was wrong. "Let's go back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But I didn't want to. I wanted to prove to her, and to myself, that there was nothing to be afraid of. I grabbed her hand, pulling her along as we kept walking, though my steps were slower now. I could feel him watching us, his eyes burning into the back of my head. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, unmoving, a statue carved from darkness. Then he moved. I didn't see it at first, but Sarah did. She squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, and when I looked back again, he had stepped out of the shadows. He was standing under the street lamp now, the yellow light casting deep, unnatural shadows across his face. And that's when I saw it. His face pale as bone, hollow eyes that gleamed with something dark and ancient. And his smile, that smile. It was wide and twisted, but there was no joy in it, just malice. It was a smile that promised something terrible. "Come here, little one," he rasped, his voice dry and crackling like dead leaves. His hand stretched out toward us, long fingers reaching, beckoning. My blood turned to ice. I froze, unable to move, as if his gaze had paralyzed me. Sarah tugged at my arm, her voice a desperate whisper. "We have to go." But I couldn't. I could only stare as he took another step forward, closer, closer. And then he laughed, a low, guttural sound that slithered through the air, chilling my bones. I finally snapped out of it, yanking Sarah's hand as we bolted down the street, our footsteps pounding in the silence that followed his laugh. I could still hear it echoing behind us, that awful sound, growing fainter as we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the end of the street, where the other kids were still trick-or-treating, oblivious to what we had just seen. My parents caught up with us laughing, asking why we had run off so suddenly. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even try. How could I? How could I tell them that a man made of shadows, with eyes like the abyss, had called to us from the dark? I kept my mouth shut for the rest of the night, and Sarah didn't say a word either. But as we walked home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching, waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that twisted smile, those hollow eyes. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, just a Halloween scare gone too far. But deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning I found Sarah in the living room, sitting by the window, staring out into the street. She looked pale, her usual brightness dimmed. "What are you doing?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "He was outside," she whispered. "I saw him again. He was standing there, under the street lamp, waiting. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want to see, because I knew even though it was daylight now, even though Halloween was over, he was still out there, and he was waiting for us.